The luxury car dealership glistened under the morning sunlight, with its pristine glass walls reflecting the gleaming vehicles inside. From polished sports cars to robust SUVs, the showroom was a testament to high-class living and exclusive clientele. The atmosphere was quiet, professional, and guarded, a space designed to cater to those with wealth and status. Every inch of the dealership screamed exclusivity, from the glossy tiled floors to the subtle, classical music playing in the background. Inside, employees in crisp uniforms moved with a precision that suggested years of training in customer service for the elite. Every interaction was calculated, every gesture refined. At the center of it all was Harold Evans, the dealership's director, a middle-aged man with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a perpetual air of superiority. Harold had been running the dealership for over a decade and took immense pride in maintaining what he called its prestigious image. He believed that only a certain kind of customer deserved to set foot inside his domain, and he had made it his mission to ensure that the dealership's exclusivity was never compromised. Harold stood near the main entrance, casually adjusting his tie while keeping a sharp eye on the few customers browsing the floor. One man in a tailored suit was examining the latest sports model, a smile of approval crossing Harold's face. This was the kind of client he valued: wealthy, respectable, and visibly successful. Harold lived by a strict mental rule: appearances matter, and those who didn't look the part didn't belong. As Harold continued surveying the room, the glass doors slid open and a woman entered. She was tall, confident, and striking in her simplicity. Her clothes, though clean and neat, were understated worn jeans, sneakers, and a lightweight jacket. She carried a small, functional bag slung over her shoulder. The contrast between her casual appearance and the dealership's opulent environment was stark. Harold's sharp eyes narrowed as he assessed her. Something about her didn't sit right with him. The woman was Tamara Mackenzie, a successful entrepreneur known in certain circles for her ability to turn struggling businesses into thriving enterprises. However, Tamara wasn't here as a regular customer. The dealership had come to her attention through industry whispers about its financial instability. She had decided to evaluate it as a potential investment, choosing to arrive unannounced and incognito. Her casual attire was intentional, a way to observe how she would be treated without the influence of her reputation or wealth. Tamara's gaze swept across the room, taking in the sparkling vehicles and polished surfaces. Her demeanor was calm and deliberate as she moved toward a sleek black luxury SUV near the back of the showroom. She examined the car thoughtfully, running her fingers lightly along its glossy surface. For her, this visit wasn't just about assessing the cars, it was a chance to observe the employees, the management, and the overall energy of the dealership. Harold, however, saw none of this. To him, Tamara was simply an outsider, someone who didn't fit the profile of his typical clientele. Her casual appearance set off an immediate alarm in his mind. He straightened his posture and began walking toward her, his polished leather shoes clicking against the tiled floor. His expression was carefully composed, but there was a faint edge of condescension in the way he held himself. "Good morning," Harold said, his tone polite but cold. "May I help you?" Tamara looked up from the SUV, her expression neutral. "Just browsing," she replied calmly, her voice steady. Harold's eyes flicked over her again, his judgment clear. "I see," he said, his tone dropping slightly. "This particular model is quite expensive. Perhaps I can direct you to something more suitable." Tamara raised an eyebrow but said nothing, her face giving away no emotion. Harold mistook her silence for submission and pressed on. "These are high-performance vehicles," he continued. gesturing toward the SUV typically purchased by clients who are familiar with this level of quality. "Are you certain this is what you're looking for?" Tamara tilted her head slightly, meeting Harold's gaze. "I know what I'm looking for," she said evenly. "Thank you." Harold's smile tightened. He didn't appreciate being brushed off, especially not by someone he had already decided didn't belong. He took a small step closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "You see, this dealership caters to a very specific clientele. Perhaps another dealership might be a better fit for you." Tamara's lips curled into the faintest smile, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned her attention back to the SUV, continuing her quiet examination. Harold, clearly irritated by her lack of reaction, glanced around the showroom. A few of his employees had noticed the interaction and were watching from a distance. The sight of them observing only added to his frustration. "Miss, I'll be frank," Harold said, his tone becoming sharper. "This isn't the kind of place for window shopping. If you're not here to make a serious purchase, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We have a reputation to maintain." Tamara finally turned to face him fully, her expression calm but with a hint of steel in her eyes. "Are you always this direct with potential customers?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with subtle challenge. Harold blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "I'm simply ensuring that our time is spent on serious buyers," he said stiffly. "I'm sure you can understand." Tamara held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "I understand," she said, her tone measured. "Thank you for your honesty." Without another word, she stepped away from the SUV and began walking toward the exit. Harold watched her go, his jaw tightening. Part of him felt triumphant, believing he had successfully rid the dealership of an undesirable presence. But there was another part of him, a smaller, quieter voice, that felt unsettled by her composure. Something about the way she carried herself didn't quite match his assumptions. As the glass doors slid shut behind Tamara, Harold turned back to the showroom, pushing the interaction from his mind. To him, it was just another routine encounter, another moment of maintaining the dealership's image. He didn't realize that this moment would mark the beginning of a chain of events that would upend everything he thought he knew about his business, his authority, and his own judgment. Tamara stepped outside into the sunlight, her expression calm and unreadable. She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. The wheels were already in motion. 2 days had passed since Tamara's quiet but memorable visit to the luxury car dealership. Harold Evans had all but forgotten her, brushing off their interaction as a routine matter of gatekeeping. To him, it was a minor event, a brief encounter with someone who didn't fit his preconceived notions of a legitimate customer. His attention had since returned to more pressing concerns: the dealership's sagging sales numbers, the pressure from corporate to improve revenue, and an upcoming visit from an influential client rumored to be interested in purchasing one of the most expensive models in their inventory. Harold's day began like any other. He arrived at the dealership sharply at 8 a.m., his crisp suit and polished shoes reflecting his meticulous nature. The showroom was already buzzing with activity. Sales staff were busy prepping the vehicles, ensuring every surface gleamed, while assistants straightened brochures and adjusted displays to perfection. Harold moved through the floor like a general inspecting his troops, nodding approvingly at his employees' efficiency. For all his flaws, he was undeniably a man who demanded excellence. Shortly after the dealership opened its doors to the public, Harold noticed an unusual flurry of activity outside. Through the glass walls, he saw a sleek black SUV pulling into the reserved VIP parking space. Behind it, a second car, a dark sedan, parked close by. Harold straightened his posture, his interest peaked. The vehicles were not unfamiliar to him, they screamed wealth and power, the kind of customers he prided himself on attracting. Two sharply dressed men stepped out of the sedan, their demeanor professional and serious. They glanced around briefly before nodding to the driver of the SUV, signaling that it was safe to step out. From the SUV emerged a woman, and Harold's stomach clenched as he recognized her immediately. It was Tamara Mackenzie. Today, however, she wasn't dressed in the casual jeans and sneakers she had worn during her first visit. Instead, she wore an impeccably tailored suit that exuded authority, paired with sleek heels that clicked sharply against the pavement as she approached the entrance. Her hair was neatly styled, and she carried a leather portfolio in one hand. She wasn't alone, her two companions flanked her like an entourage, their serious expressions making it clear this was no casual visit. Harold's initial reaction was one of confusion. What was she doing back here? Had she come to cause trouble after their last encounter? He quickly pushed the thought aside, reminding himself of her previous demeanor. She had seemed calm, almost detached. Surely she wasn't the type to make a scene. Still, her presence, combined with her dramatic arrival, unsettled him. As Tamara stepped into the showroom, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The low hum of activity among the staff quieted as employees glanced her way, sensing the tension in Harold's body language as he moved toward her. His polished smile barely concealed his unease. "Here's Mackenzie," Harold greeted her, his voice clipped but polite. "What a surprise to see you again." Tamara's lips curled into a faint smile. "Good morning, Mr. Evans," she replied smoothly. "I trust you've been well." "Well enough," he said, his gaze flickering to her companions. "To what do we owe the pleasure of your visit today?" Tamara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a slow look around the showroom, her eyes sweeping over the rows of pristine vehicles and the polished surfaces of the displays. It wasn't until her gaze returned to Harold that she spoke again. "I've been thinking about our last conversation," she said, her tone light but with an undertone Harold couldn't quite place. "It left an impression on me." Harold's smile tightened. "I hope it was a positive one." "That remains to be seen," Tamara said evenly. "But I'm not here to dwell on the past. Today, I'm here on business." Harold blinked, caught off guard by her directness. "Business?" he repeated. "Yes," she said, gesturing toward her companions. "This is Mr. Carter, my legal advisor, and Mr. Hughes, my financial consultant. We'll need access to your office and some of the back-end facilities for a brief evaluation." Harold's confusion deepened. "Evaluation? What exactly are you?" "Let's not waste time," Tamara interrupted, her calm but commanding tone cutting through his question. "I believe you'll find that we're within our rights to be here." She opened her portfolio and handed him a document. Harold glanced at it, his eyes narrowing as he read the first few lines. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly. Tamara tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "A letter of intent," she said simply. "My team and I are conducting a due diligence review as part of an acquisition process." Harold felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. "Acquisition," he echoed, his voice sharp. "What acquisition?" "Your dealership," Tamara said, her tone as smooth as glass. "I'm purchasing it." For a moment, Harold could only stare at her, his mind struggling to process her words. The dealership. His dealership. It wasn't possible. It had to be some kind of joke, a misunderstanding. Finally, he found his voice. "There must be some mistake," he said, his tone laced with indignation. "This dealership isn't for sale." "That's not entirely accurate," Tamara said, her calm demeanor unshaken by his reaction. "I've been in contact with your corporate office for several weeks. They've reviewed my offer and found it acceptable. In fact, The deal is already in its final stages. Harold's face flushed with anger. This is absurd. I would have been informed if something like this was happening. No one makes decisions about this dealership without consulting me. Tamara's gaze didn't waver. It's true that you weren't consulted, she said, her tone softening slightly. But perhaps that's because your corporate office recognized the need for a change in leadership. The words landed like a slap. Harold's jaw tightened, his carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. Around them, the employees who had been trying to discreetly eavesdrop exchanged nervous glances. The tension in the room was palpable. I demand to speak with someone from corporate, Harold said, his voice rising. This can't be happening. You're welcome to contact them, Tamara said, gesturing toward the phone on his desk. But I assure you, the deal is legitimate. I've already received preliminary approval to begin on-site evaluations. Harold's mind raced, a mix of disbelief, anger, and panic swirling inside him. He couldn't believe this was happening. This woman, this stranger who had walked into his dealership just days ago, was now claiming to own it. It was unthinkable. And yet, as he glanced at the document in his hands and the composed expressions of her team, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was telling the truth. This isn't over, he snapped, throwing the document onto his desk. You won't get away with this. Tamara's smile returned, faint but unshakable. I have no intention of getting away with anything, Mr. Evans, she said. I'm simply ensuring that this dealership reaches its full potential, something it hasn't been able to do under your leadership. Without waiting for a response, she turned to her team and nodded. Let's begin, she said. Together, they moved toward the back office, leaving Harold standing in the middle of the showroom, his fists clenched and his mind racing. As the doors to the office closed behind them, Harold felt an unfamiliar sense of dread settling over him. For the first time in his career, he was no longer in control. The tension in the dealership was palpable. Harold Evans, still reeling from Tamara Mackenzie's bombshell announcement, stood frozen in the middle of the showroom floor. The polished surfaces and gleaming cars around him seemed to blur, their shine mocking the unraveling of his carefully constructed world. He couldn't comprehend how this woman, who just days ago had seemed so unassuming, could have orchestrated such a calculated move against him. His pride burned, and his temper flared beneath his thinning veneer of professionalism. In the back office, Tamara and her team were already hard at work. Mr. Carter, her legal advisor, reviewed financial records with methodical precision, while Mr. Hughes, her financial consultant, examined sales data and employee contracts. Tamara sat at the head of the conference table, her posture composed yet commanding, quietly assessing the mountain of paperwork they had requested upon arrival. Though outwardly calm, she was laser-focused, ensuring every step of this acquisition would be as smooth and meticulous as she had planned. Meanwhile, Harold paced back and forth in the showroom, his mind racing with a mixture of indignation and desperation. He refused to believe that the corporate office would approve such a deal without consulting him, the man who had run this dealership for over a decade. He stormed toward the receptionist desk, startling the young woman stationed there. "Get me on the phone with corporate," Harold barked, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the showroom. "Now." The receptionist flinched slightly at his tone but nodded quickly, fumbling with the phone. Harold's anger was escalating with every second that passed, and the sight of his employees casting uneasy glances at him only fueled his frustration. He had always prided himself on being in control, on commanding respect or fear, if necessary. But now, in the face of Tamara's calculated takeover, his authority felt precarious, slipping through his fingers like sand. The receptionist handed him the phone, her nervous eyes darting between Harold and the conference room where Tamara and her team were stationed. Harold snatched the receiver and punched in the number for corporate headquarters, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. The line rang once, twice, before a familiar voice answered. "This is David Harper, Regional Director. How can I help you?" "David, this is Harold Evans," Harold said, his tone sharp. "What the hell is going on with this so-called acquisition? I just had some woman waltz in here claiming she's buying my dealership. This is the first I'm hearing of it. What's going on?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Harold's jaw tightened. He could feel the blood rushing to his head, his patience wearing thin. "Harold," David said finally, his tone measured, "I was wondering when you'd call. Look, I know this is a shock, but the decision was made at the corporate level. Ms. Mackenzie approached us weeks ago with an offer that was compelling." "Compelling?" Harold spat. "What about my position? My years of running this place? Do I mean nothing to you people?" "It's not personal, Harold," David said, though his tone carried little sympathy. "The numbers don't lie. Sales have been declining for years, customer complaints are up, and employee turnover is through the roof. Corporate felt it was time for a change, and Ms. Mackenzie presented a vision that aligns with the direction we want to take the dealership." Harold's face burned with anger, his grip on the phone tightening. "A vision? What vision? She doesn't know a damn thing about this business. Her track record speaks for itself," David said calmly. "She has a history of turning struggling businesses into profitable enterprises. Frankly, Harold, we believe she's the right person to revitalize the dealership." Harold opened his mouth to argue, but David cut him off. "Look, I understand this is difficult for you, but the deal is already in motion. There's nothing you can do to stop it. I suggest you cooperate with Ms. Mackenzie and her team. It'll make the transition smoother for everyone involved." The line went dead, leaving Harold standing in stunned silence. He stared at the phone in his hand, his mind racing with a mixture of disbelief and fury. Cooperate. Smoother transition. The words felt like salt in a wound. For years, Harold had prided himself on his leadership, his ability to maintain the dealership's exclusive image. And now, with one phone call, it was all slipping away. Slamming the receiver down, Harold turned on his heel and marched toward the back office. His employees, sensing the storm brewing, quickly averted their gazes and busied themselves with tasks, not wanting to draw his ire. Harold pushed open the door to the conference room with more force than necessary, the sharp sound echoing through the space. Tamara looked up from her seat, her expression calm and unreadable. Mr. Carter and Mr. Hughes paused their work, glancing at Harold with mild curiosity but no trace of intimidation. The contrast between Harold's barely contained anger and their composed demeanor was striking. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Harold demanded, his voice trembling with rage. "You waltz in here, throw around some papers, and expect me to just roll over. This is my dealership." Tamara set down the document she had been reviewing and folded her hands on the table. Her gaze met Harold's, steady and unflinching. "It's not personal, Mr. Evans," she said evenly, echoing David Harper's earlier words. "It's business." "Business," Harold repeated, his voice rising. "You think you can just walk in here and take everything I've built? You don't know the first thing about running this place." Tamara raised an eyebrow, her expression cool. "From what I've seen so far, there's quite a bit about this place that could use improvement." Harold's face reddened further. "Improvement? Do you have any idea what it takes to maintain a dealership like this? The reputation, the clientele? This isn't some discount chain you can swoop in and fix. It's a high-class operation." "Is that what you call it?" Tamara said, her tone calm but cutting. "High class. Tell me, Mr. Evans, how do you explain the financial irregularities in these records? The complaints from customers who feel they've been treated unfairly? The high turnover rate among your staff? Is that what you call high class?" Harold bristled, his fists clenching at his sides. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I think I do," Tamara said, her gaze unwavering. "And so does corporate. That's why they approved this acquisition. They see the same potential in this dealership that I do, but they also see the same problems." "You don't belong here," Harold spat, his composure finally breaking. "You don't understand this world, this business." Tamara's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of steel in her calm exterior. "I understand more than you think, Mr. Evans. And I understand one very important thing. Businesses thrive when they adapt and grow, not when they cling to outdated ideas and prejudices." The words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Harold opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time, he found himself at a loss, his anger unable to overpower the unshakable authority in Tamara's voice. "I suggest you take some time to reflect," Tamara continued, her tone softer but no less firm. "This transition is happening, whether you like it or not. How you choose to handle it is up to you." Without waiting for a response, she turned back to the document in front of her, effectively dismissing him. Mr. Carter and Mr. Hughes resumed their work, their calm focus a stark contrast to Harold's simmering rage. Defeated but not yet ready to admit it, Harold stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. As he returned to the showroom, his employees avoided his gaze, their unease palpable. Harold clenched his fists, his mind racing with thoughts of retaliation. He wasn't going to let this woman take everything from him without a fight. Not if he had anything to say about it. Harold sat in his office, the blinds drawn tight, casting horizontal shadows across his desk. The sunlight outside was warm and bright, a mockery of the storm raging in his mind. He had spent the last 2 hours pacing, replaying his conversation with corporate, with Tamara, and now staring at the papers sprawled before him. Documents he could barely read through the haze of frustration. Financial reports, internal memos, projections, all of them a reminder that the world he thought he controlled was slipping through his fingers. Corporate's betrayal stung the most. They hadn't even given him the courtesy of a warning before accepting Tamara's offer. No heads up, no chance to prove his worth or fight for his position. He had worked tirelessly to maintain what he believed was a prestigious image for this dealership. He had sacrificed time, relationships, and peace of mind to ensure its reputation was untarnished, at least in his eyes. And now they were selling it out from under him to someone they deemed more capable. Someone like her. He clenched his jaw as his mind circled back to Tamara. Her calmness infuriated him. She had walked into his dealership, into his domain, and with little more than a few signatures and a pair of smug associates, had declared herself its future. The audacity. Worse yet, she had poked holes in his methods, his management, his very identity as a leader, and she'd done it so effortlessly, as if dismantling his authority were nothing more than an afterthought. A knock on the door jolted him from his spiraling thoughts. He ignored it, pretending he hadn't heard, but the knock came again, firmer this time. "What?" he barked, the word sharp enough to cut glass. The door opened cautiously, and Sandra, his longest-serving employee, stepped inside. She was in her mid-40s, with a kind but weary face that often reflected the strain of dealing with Harold's temperament. She had worked under him for nearly a decade, navigating his moods and demands with a patience that most of the younger employees couldn't muster. "Mr. Evans," she began, her voice measured. "Ms. Mackenzie asked me to deliver this to you." She placed a slim folder on his desk and hesitated, as if debating whether to say more. Harold glared at the folder as if it were a live grenade. "What is it?" he snapped, not looking up. "She said it's an initial assessment of the dealership's operations," Sandra explained. "She thought it would be helpful for you to review." Harold's lips curled into a sneer. "Helpful," he repeated mockingly. "Of course. I'm sure she's just brimming with helpful advice." Sandra shifted uncomfortably. She also asked if you'd be available for a meeting later this afternoon. She wants to discuss her plans for the transition. Harold's sneer deepened. "Her plans," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Wonderful. Tell her I'm busy." Sandra hesitated again, her brow furrowing. "Mr. Evans, I know this is difficult, but it might be a good idea to hear her out. She seems—" Harold cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. "That will be all, Sandra." She pressed her lips together, nodded, and left without another word. As the door closed behind her, Harold stared at the folder on his desk, the weight of his frustration pressing down on him like a physical force. After a long moment, he reached for the folder, his hand hovering above it, as if touching it would somehow solidify Tamara's takeover. Finally, with a growl of annoyance, he snatched it up and flipped it open. The contents were meticulous. Charts, graphs, and detailed notes laid out the dealership's financial state in stark, undeniable terms. Declining sales, increasing overhead, customer complaints, employee turnover. Each page was like a punch to the gut, confirming everything corporate had said, and worse, proving Tamara right. But what struck Harold most wasn't the numbers themselves, it was the notes in the margins, written in Tamara's neat, precise handwriting. Potential to expand customer demographics with improved marketing strategies. Employee morale appears low, recommend targeted engagement initiatives. Lack of diversity in leadership contributing to rigid decision-making. The last note made his blood boil. Lack of diversity. What did that even mean? He'd hired people based on their qualifications, their ability to fit the dealership's image. What did it matter if his leadership team all looked like him? They got the job done, or so he'd thought. He slammed the folder shut, his jaw tightening. She was dissecting his life's work as if it were a case study, pointing out flaws that he hadn't even considered flaws. And the worst part, she wasn't wrong. That realization settled over him like a heavy cloud, feeding the bitter cocktail of resentment and self-doubt brewing inside him. By the time the scheduled meeting rolled around, Harold was seething but determined to regain control of the narrative. He strode into the conference room, his shoulders squared and his expression set in stone. Tamara was already there, seated at the head of the table with Carter and Hughes on either side of her. They looked up as he entered, their expressions polite but unreadable. "Mr. Evans," Tamara said, nodding in greeting. "Thank you for joining us." He didn't respond, instead pulling out a chair and sitting down with a heavy thud. He folded his arms across his chest, his gaze locked on her with thinly veiled hostility. Tamara, unperturbed, slid a copy of the same folder across the table toward him. "I trust you've had a chance to review my initial assessment," she said. "I've seen it," Harold said curtly. "And I have to say your approach is bold." Tamara raised an eyebrow. "Bold?" she repeated. "I'd call it thorough." Harold leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "What gives you the right to walk in here and criticize how I've run this place? You've been here all of 2 days, and you think you know better than someone who's dedicated over a decade to this business. I think the numbers speak for themselves," Tamara said evenly. "But this isn't about pointing fingers, Mr. Evans. It's about moving forward." "Moving forward," Harold said, his voice rising. You mean bulldozing everything I've built and replacing it with your grand vision? Is that what you call moving forward? Tamara met his glare with calm resolve. What I call it, Mr. Evans, is ensuring this dealership survives. If that means making changes, then yes, changes will be made. But this isn't personal. It's about what's best for the business. Harold's fists clenched on the table. Spare me the corporate platitudes, he snapped. You don't care about this place. You don't care about the people who work here. All you care about is adding another trophy to your collection. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Tamara's face, something sharp and fleeting, gone before Harold could place it. When she spoke again, her voice was calm but steely. You're right about one thing, she said. I do care about adding this dealership to my portfolio. But not because it's a trophy, because it's a challenge. And because I see potential here, potential that's been stifled by outdated practices and short-sighted leadership. The words landed like a slap, and Harold's face darkened. Before he could respond, Tamara continued, her tone softening slightly. I understand this is difficult for you, Mr. Evans, she said. But the truth is, this dealership needs more than what you've been able to give it. It needs a fresh perspective, a new direction. That's why corporate approved this acquisition, because they believe in what I can bring to the table. Harold sat back in his chair, his anger simmering just below the surface. He wanted to argue, to lash out, but the weight of her words and the deniable truth in them kept him silent. For the first time, he felt the full gravity of his situation. This wasn't just a fight for control of the dealership. It was a reckoning, one that he was slowly realizing he couldn't win. The meeting continued, with Tamara outlining her plans for the transition in meticulous detail. Harold listened in silence, his mind a storm of resentment and reluctant acceptance. By the time it ended, he felt drained, his confidence eroded by the steady, unyielding force of Tamara's resolve. As he left the conference room, he couldn't shake the feeling that the walls of his world were closing in and that Tamara Mackenzie was holding the keys to his escape, or his downfall. The dealership's atmosphere had shifted dramatically since Tamara Mackenzie's arrival. Employees, who had spent years under Harold Evans' rigid and often oppressive leadership, now found themselves cautiously observing a new dynamic unfold. The whispers in the break room had turned from grumblings about Harold's temper to hushed speculations about what Tamara's leadership might bring. Yet, amidst this uncertainty, one thing was clear: the dealership was no longer Harold's kingdom. Harold, however, refused to accept this reality. He saw Tamara's calm demeanor not as strength, but as arrogance, and her methodical approach to the dealership's transformation as an affront to his legacy. In his mind, she was tearing down everything he had built, piece by piece, under the guise of improvement. The thought consumed him, driving him deeper into a spiral of anger and desperation. His frustration boiled over one afternoon when Sandra, his long-serving assistant, approached him with a folder in her hands and an uneasy expression on her face. Mr. Evans, she began hesitantly, Ms. Mackenzie asked me to deliver this to you. It's a summary of her proposed staffing changes. Harold snatched the folder from her hands, his jaw tightening. Staffing changes, he repeated, his voice sharp. What kind of changes? Sandra shifted uncomfortably. She's been meeting with some of the employees to discuss their roles and responsibilities. She mentioned restructuring. Harold's face darkened. Restructuring, he muttered, flipping through the pages. The document outlined a plan to redistribute responsibilities, promote underutilized employees, and, most infuriatingly to him, remove several senior managers his loyal inner circle. At the top of the list was Bill Anderson, his second in command and longtime confidant. This is absurd, Harold snapped, slamming the folder onto his desk. "She's undermining everything. Who does she think she is?" Sandra hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Evans, some of the employees seem hopeful about the changes. A lot of them have felt overlooked or underappreciated. Maybe this could be a good." "Enough," Harold cut her off, his voice cold. "I don't need a lecture on leadership from you, Sandra." Sandra flinched but said nothing, quietly leaving the room. Harold glared at the folder on his desk, his anger simmering. Tamara wasn't just targeting the dealership, she was targeting him, stripping away his authority piece by piece. He couldn't let it continue. That evening, Harold decided to confront Tamara directly. He found her in the conference room, seated at the head of the table with her team. The room was quiet, except for the soft rustle of papers and the occasional click of a laptop keyboard. Tamara looked up as Harold entered, her expression calm but alert. "Mr. Evans," she said, setting down her pen. "What can I do for you?" Harold didn't bother with pleasantries. "We need to talk about this so-called restructuring," he said, holding up the folder. "You can't just waltz in here and start firing people. Bill Anderson has been with me for over 10 years. He's one of the most experienced managers we have." Tamara regarded him steadily. "I'm aware of Mr. Anderson's tenure," she said, "but experience isn't the only factor to consider. This dealership needs leaders who can adapt to change, foster collaboration, and support the staff. Based on my conversations with employees, Mr. Anderson hasn't been meeting those expectations." Harold bristled. "You've been here less than a week. What do you know about my team or what they need?" "I know enough," Tamara said evenly. "I've spoken to nearly every employee here, and the feedback has been consistent. Many of them feel undervalued, overworked, and unsupported. That's a leadership issue, Mr. Evans. And as the head of this dealership, that falls on you." Harold's face flushed with anger. "You don't get to judge my leadership," he snapped. "You don't know what it takes to run this place. Maybe not the way you've run it," Tamara said, her tone sharpening slightly. "But I do know what it takes to build a successful business. And that starts with listening to your employees, valuing their contributions, and creating an environment where they can thrive. That's not what's been happening here." Harold slammed the folder onto the table. "You think you can just waltz in here and fix everything with your grand ideas and your corporate buzzwords? This dealership isn't some broken toy for you to play with. It's a business. My business. It's not your business anymore," Tamara said firmly. "That decision has already been made. I'm not here to argue about the past, Mr. Evans. I'm here to ensure this dealership has a future. If that means making difficult decisions, so be it." Her words hit like a hammer, and for a moment, Harold was speechless. He had always prided himself on his ability to command a room, to assert his authority with ease. But now, faced with Tamara's unwavering resolve, he felt powerless. Finally, he forced himself to speak. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low but edged with menace. "You think you're saving this dealership, but all you're doing is destroying it. The people here respect me. They trust me. They won't follow you." Tamara held his gaze, her expression unyielding. "We'll see," she said simply. The confrontation left Harold fuming, but it also stoked the fires of his desperation. Over the next few days, he began devising a plan to undermine Tamara's authority. He called private meetings with his inner circle, urging them to resist the changes and spread doubt among the staff. He planted rumors about Tamara's intentions, suggesting she planned to sell the dealership to a faceless conglomerate and leave them all jobless. At first, his efforts seemed to have some effect. A few employees began expressing concerns about the restructuring, questioning whether Tamara's changes were truly in their best interests. Harold took this as a sign of victory, believing he could turn the tide against her. but his confidence was short-lived. One afternoon, Tamara called an all-staff meeting in the showroom. Employees gathered in small clusters, murmuring among themselves as they waited. Harold stood off to the side, arms crossed, his expression sour. He had no intention of participating but wanted to observe. Tamara stepped forward, her calm demeanor commanding attention. "Thank you all for being here," she began. "I wanted to take this opportunity to address some of the concerns I've heard over the past few days. I understand that change can be difficult, and I want to be transparent about what's happening and why." Her words were measured, her tone firm but empathetic. She explained her vision for the dealership, emphasizing the importance of collaboration, innovation, and respect. She acknowledged the challenges they faced but framed them as opportunities for growth. And most importantly, she listened. She invited employees to share their thoughts, their frustrations, and their ideas for improvement. One by one, employees began to speak. Some were hesitant at first, but as Tamara responded to their concerns with genuine consideration, the atmosphere began to shift. Employees who had felt ignored or dismissed under Harold's leadership now felt heard, and their cautious optimism began to grow. Harold watched in silence, his jaw tightening with every passing moment. He could see the cracks forming in his carefully cultivated image of authority. The loyalty he had always taken for granted was slipping away, replaced by a growing trust in Tamara. By the end of the meeting, it was clear the tide had turned. Employees who had once feared speaking out now felt empowered, and Harold, for all his efforts to resist, was left standing on the sidelines, a relic of a bygone era. As the meeting dispersed, Tamara caught Harold's eye and gave him a small, knowing smile. It wasn't smug or triumphant, it was a smile that said, "You had your chance. Now it's my turn." Harold felt his stomach drop, the weight of his failure settling over him like a lead blanket. Back in his office, Harold sank into his chair, staring blankly at the papers on his desk. For the first time, he truly understood that his fight was over, and the realization was devastating. The dealership was unusually quiet the morning of the final meeting. It was the kind of silence that pressed down on the room, heavy and suffocating, as though the entire building were holding its breath. Employees moved through the showroom with hushed voices and tentative glances, acutely aware that something was coming, something that would change everything. At the center of it all, Tamara Mackenzie sat in the conference room, her expression calm and unreadable, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing in Harold Evans' mind. Harold had spent the past night poring over files, making frantic phone calls, and drafting desperate emails to anyone at corporate who might still listen to him. But the responses had been the same, polite, firm, and unyielding. The deal was done. Tamara's acquisition was final. No amount of protesting or bargaining could change that. He was out of options, and it gnawed at him like a festering wound. By the time the clock struck 9, the staff had gathered in the main showroom, summoned by Tamara's instructions. Chairs were arranged in neat rows, and employees filled them hesitantly, their faces a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and among a few quiet hope. Tamara stood at the front of the room, her posture composed but commanding, flanked by her advisors, Carter and Hughes. Harold stood to the side, arms crossed and jaw clenched, his presence an ominous shadow looming over the proceedings. "Good morning, everyone," Tamara began, her voice steady and measured. "Thank you all for being here. I know the past few weeks have been a time of uncertainty, and I appreciate your patience as we've navigated this transition." Her eyes swept over the room, meeting the gaze of each employee with a calm confidence that demanded attention. I wanted to take this opportunity to outline my vision for this dealership and address some of the concerns that have been raised. But before I do that, there's something I need to share with all of you." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the room. During my review of the dealership's operations, I uncovered some troubling practices that have been taking place under previous management. Practices that have negatively impacted not only the business but also many of you sitting here today. A ripple of unease spread through the crowd. Harold stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he realized where this was heading. Tamara continued, her voice firm but empathetic. "I've heard from employees who felt overlooked and undervalued, who were denied opportunities to grow or were subjected to unfair treatment. I've seen evidence of discriminatory practices that have no place in any workplace, let alone one that claims to value excellence and professionalism." The words hit like a thunderclap, and a murmur rose among the employees. Harold's face flushed with anger, but he said nothing, his teeth grinding as he forced himself to stay silent. "Let me be clear," Tamara said, her tone sharpening. "This behavior stops now. This dealership will no longer be a place where intimidation or prejudice are tolerated. We are moving forward with integrity, inclusivity, and respect for every single person who works here." She turned her attention to the employees seated in the front row. "To those of you who have felt silenced or ignored, know that your voices matter. Your contributions matter. And moving forward, this dealership will be a place where you are valued and supported." The murmurs grew louder, a mix of astonishment and cautious optimism. For employees who had spent years enduring Harold's domineering leadership, Tamara's words felt like a lifeline, a promise of something better. Harold, however, was seething. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a knife. "Enough," he snapped, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "You come in here with your lofty ideals and your pretty speeches, but you have no idea what it takes to run this place. Do you think you can fix everything with your corporate jargon and your so-called vision? This dealership was fine before you showed up." Tamara turned to face him, her expression unflinching. "Fine?" she repeated, her voice calm but steely. "Is that what you call declining sales, high employee turnover, and a culture of fear? Because from where I'm standing, this dealership was anything but fine." Harold took a step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "You don't know anything about what it takes to keep a business like this afloat. I've spent years building this place, maintaining its reputation, and now you're tearing it all down." "I'm not tearing it down," Tamara said firmly. "I'm rebuilding it, and sometimes rebuilding means making difficult choices." Her words landed with the weight of truth, and Harold felt his control slipping further and further away. He glanced around the room, searching for allies, for anyone who might speak up in his defense. But the employees avoided his gaze, their silence a damning indictment of his leadership. Tamara turned her attention back to the crowd. "I know change is hard," she said, her tone softening slightly. "But change is necessary if we want this dealership to thrive. I believe in the potential of this business, and I believe in all of you. Together we can create something truly exceptional." She paused, allowing the words to sink in before continuing. "To that end, I've made some decisions about the leadership structure moving forward. Effective immediately, Harold Evans will be stepping down as director of this dealership." The room fell silent, the weight of her announcement hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Harold's face turned an alarming shade of red, his fury bubbling to the surface. "You can't do this," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can just waltz in here and take everything I've built? I won't let you. It's already done," Tamara said, her tone unwavering. The decision was made at the corporate level, and it's final. Harold's fists clenched, and for a moment it seemed as though he might lash out. But then, as the full weight of her words settled over him, something inside him seemed to break. His shoulders slumped, and the fire in his eyes dimmed. He looked around the room once more, but all he saw were blank faces and lowered gazes. The loyalty he had once commanded was gone, replaced by a quiet, collective relief that he was no longer in charge. Tamara stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "This isn't the end for you, Harold," she said. "You've had a long career, and I'm sure you'll find opportunities elsewhere. But it's time for this dealership to move forward." Harold said nothing, his jaw tight as he turned and walked out of the room, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence. Tamara turned back to the employees, her gaze steady. "This is a new beginning," she said. "For this dealership, for all of you, and for what we can achieve together. Let's make it count." The room erupted in applause, a sound that carried a sense of hope and possibility. For the first time in years, the employees felt a glimmer of optimism, a belief that things could change for the better. And as Tamara stood at the front of the room, her presence commanding and resolute, it was clear that this was just the beginning of something extraordinary. The weeks following Harold Evans' departure brought a transformation to the dealership that no one could have predicted. The tense, suffocating atmosphere that had loomed over the showroom for years lifted, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and possibility. Employees, once wary and withdrawn, now moved with energy and focus, emboldened by Tamara Mackenzie's leadership. The change was not just visible, it was palpable. Tamara wasted no time implementing her vision. Her first move was to hold individual meetings with every employee, from the senior managers down to the janitorial staff. She listened attentively to their concerns, their ideas and their aspirations, making it clear that their voices mattered. Some were hesitant at first, unsure if her promises of inclusivity and respect were genuine, but her sincerity quickly won them over. She also overhauled the dealership's operations, replacing outdated processes with modern, efficient systems. Marketing strategies were revamped to broaden the dealership's appeal, targeting a more diverse customer base without losing the prestige that defined its brand. Employee training programs were introduced, focusing on customer service, teamwork, and leadership development. Promotions were no longer handed out based on favoritism but earned through merit and performance. One of Tamara's most symbolic decisions was the appointment of Sandra, Harold's former assistant, as the new operations manager. It was a move that shocked many, but inspired even more. Sandra had spent years in the shadow of Harold's domineering presence, quietly ensuring the dealership functioned smoothly while receiving little recognition for her efforts. Under Tamara's guidance, she flourished, quickly proving herself as a capable and compassionate leader. Her promotion sent a powerful message. This was a new era, one where talent and dedication would be rewarded, regardless of rank or background. The physical transformation of the dealership mirrored its cultural shift. The sterile, impersonal showroom was revamped into a more welcoming space, with warm lighting, comfortable seating areas, and an art installation featuring sleek, modern designs that celebrated the beauty of automotive engineering. A wall near the entrance was dedicated to showcasing employee achievements, from sales milestones to personal accomplishments. Customers, many of whom had previously found the dealership intimidating, now remarked on how inviting and professional it felt. Tamara's vision extended beyond the dealership itself. She partnered with local community organizations to sponsor events, fund scholarships, and provide internships for young people interested in the automotive industry. The dealership became a hub of activity, not just a place to buy cars, but a symbol of progress and possibility in the community. Yet, for all her success, Tamara remained humble and approachable. She often walked the showroom floor, chatting with employees and customers alike, her presence a constant reminder of the dealership's new direction. Her leadership style was firm but fair, her decisions guided by a clear sense of purpose and integrity. The impact of these changes was undeniable. Sales skyrocketed as the dealership attracted a broader range of customers. Employees reported higher job satisfaction and turnover plummeted. The dealership's reputation, once tarnished by Harold's elitist practices, now shone as a beacon of excellence and innovation. Corporate executives, initially skeptical of Tamara's unorthodox methods, were now singing her praises, marveling at how quickly she had turned the business around. But perhaps the most profound transformation was the sense of unity that now defined the dealership. Employees who had once felt isolated and undervalued now worked together as a cohesive team, driven by a shared vision. The divisions that Harold had fostered were replaced by a culture of collaboration and mutual respect. One afternoon, a few months after taking over, Tamara stood by the showroom's entrance, watching as a customer completed a purchase. It was an older black woman, elegantly dressed, her face lighting up as she was handed the keys to a sleek luxury sedan. Tamara smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. Moments like these were what made her work worthwhile, creating opportunities, breaking down barriers, and proving that excellence and inclusivity could go hand in hand. As the customer drove off, Sandra approached Tamara, a clipboard in hand. "Another happy customer," she said with a smile. "That's the third car sold today." Tamara nodded, her eyes following the car as it disappeared down the street. "It's a good day," she said simply. Sandra hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "You know, there's something I've been meaning to say. I wasn't sure about you at first. When you walked in here that first day, I thought you were just another corporate executive here to shake things up and leave us to deal with the mess." Tamara turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "And now?" Sandra smiled. "Now I see what you were trying to do, and I want to thank you for listening to us, for believing in us, for giving us a chance." Tamara's expression softened. "It wasn't just me," she said. "It was all of you. This dealership isn't just about one person, it's about the team. And I'm proud of what we've built together." Sandra nodded, her smile widening. "So am I." As Sandra walked away, Tamara allowed herself a moment of reflection. The journey had been challenging, filled with obstacles and resistance, but it had been worth it. The dealership was thriving, its future brighter than ever. And in the process, Tamara had proven something to herself, that her approach, her vision, and her values could stand up to any challenge. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a familiar voice. "Ms. Mackenzie." Tamara turned to see an older man standing near the entrance, his expression both nervous and hopeful. He was dressed simply, with a weathered look that suggested years of hard work. He held a brochure in his hands, his fingers fidgeting with the edges. "Good afternoon," Tamara said, offering him a warm smile. "How can I help you?" "I was, looking at one of the cars outside," he said hesitantly. "It's a little out of my price range, but I thought maybe there's something similar, something I could afford." Tamara stepped closer, her smile never wavering. "Let's take a look," she said. "We'll find something that works for you." The man's face brightened, and together they walked toward the lot, their conversation easy and unhurried. It was moments like this that reminded Tamara why she did what she did, not just to build businesses, but to create opportunities, to break down barriers, and to make a difference in people's lives. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the dealership, Tamara stood by the entrance, watching as employees and customers moved through the space. The sound of laughter and conversation filled the air, a far cry from the tense silence that had once defined the showroom. The dealership was no longer just a place of business, it was a community, a testament to what could be achieved with vision, determination, and heart. And as Tamara stepped back inside, ready to tackle the next challenge, she knew this was just the beginning. The dealership's story was far from over, and she was excited to see where the journey would take them next.